By the end of the ninth century, Rome was no longer the stable center of Christian authority it claimed to be. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed centuries earlier, and what remained was not order but overlap. Competing noble families, weak emperors, local warlords, and a church forced to operate in political vacuum. The papacy did not exist above this chaos, it was embedded in it. A pope was not only a spiritual leader, but a political figure, whose survival depended on alliances, protection, and timing. Elections were rarely neutral, and removal was often violent. Short pontificates, forced abdications, and sudden deaths were part of the system rather than its failure. Rome itself was dominated by rival aristocratic factions. Control over the papal throne meant access to legitimacy, wealth, and influence far beyond the city. As a result, the office of pope became a tool in ongoing power struggles, not a stabilizing force. In this environment, law and ritual took on a different function. When no authority was strong enough to enforce obedience by force alone, legitimacy had to be performed. Councils, trials, and public ceremonies became substitutes for real power. The appearance of order mattered more than the order itself. It is within this fractured paranoid world that the Cadaver Synod became understandable, not as a madness, but as a political act shaped by a system that had already lost its center. In a system like this, survival depended less on doctrine than on positioning. Pope Formosus did not rise above Rome's instability, he learned how to move within it. Formosus came from Rome's aristocratic background and advanced through the church as both a cleric and a political operator. As a bishop of Porto, one of the most prominent sees near the city, he was already entangled in the same networks of loyalty and rivalry that defined papal politics. His influence extended beyond Rome through diplomatic missions, placing him directly in the field where religious authority and secular power overlapped. This visibility made him useful but also exposed. Formosus became the target of accusations that were as much political as they were canonical. He was charged with abandoning his diocese, violating oaths, and aspiring to the papal office illegitimately. The result was excommunication and exile, an attempt to remove him from the political board entirely. Yet exile did not erase him. The charges were later lifted, not because consensus had been reached, but because power had shifted. Formosus returned to Rome, reintegrated into church life, and in 891 was elected pope according to the formal procedures of the time. Legally, his papacy was valid. Politically, it was unresolved. Formosus carried with him not only authority, but unfinished conflicts. His past hadn't been settled. It had merely been postponed, and in a world where legitimacy depended on performance and memory, postponement was dangerous. Formosus did not fall because he broke the system. He fell because he used it in a way that threatened those who depended on its instability. The central conflict of his papacy was not theological, but political. Italy in the late 9th century was contested territory, and the imperial title was still a source of legitimacy. By choosing sides, a pope could tilt the balance of power far beyond Rome. Formosus did exactly that. He supported Arnulf of Carinthia, a ruler from outside Italy, and invited him to intervene militarily. Arnulf entered the peninsula, advanced on Rome, and was crowned emperor with papal backing. For Formosus, this was a strategic move, meant to counter local domination over the papacy. For Rome's ruling factions, this was an act of betrayal. The aristocratic networks that controlled the city lost both influence and legitimacy as a result. Formosus had used the authority of the papal office to override them, replacing local power with an external ally. Even after Arnulf withdrew and later fell ill, the damage remained. What made the situation explosive was that Formosus' decisions did not end with his death. Bishops he had appointed remained in office. Ordinations he had performed continued to structure the church. Political consequences persisted, embedded in institutions rather than individuals. As long as Formosus was remembered as a legitimate pope, his choices could not be undone. This is where hostility turned into necessity. It was no longer enough to oppose his policies or discredit his character. His entire papacy had to be erased, legally, ritually, and retrospectively. Only by declaring Formosus illegitimate from the start could his enemies reclaim control over the present. Hatred alone did not lead to the Cadaver Synod. The fear that past was still active did. By the standards of the time, condemning a formal pope was not unprecedented. What made Formosus different was that a simple denunciation could not undo what he had done. His authority was embedded in the structure of the church. Bishops he had ordained were still exercising power. Decisions he had issued continued to shape religious life. These were not opinions that could be dismissed. They were acts that had already taken place. The problem was canonical. Church law did not allow his opponents to selectively invalidate his actions while accepting his legitimacy. Either Formosus has been pope or he had never been one at all. There was no middle ground. This is why his enemies turned backwards. They did not seek justice in the present, but revisions in retrospect. If Formosus could be declared illegitimate from the start, then every act that followed could collapse with him. To achieve that, they needed more than rhetoric. They needed a legal performance, a trial, a verdict, and a ritual capable of overriding authority itself. His body mattered because authority had been carried through it. By placing Formosus physically on a trial, the court could symbolically strip him of office, rank, and memory. The trial was not aimed at punishment, it was aimed at erasure. What followed was extreme, not because it was irrational, but because anything less would have failed. The trial that followed, later known as Cadaver Synod, took place in early 897. By this point, the goal was no longer debate or clarification. The outcome had already been decided. What remained was performance. Formosus's body was exhumed months after his death. It was dressed in full papal vestments and seated on a throne inside the church. A deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the corpse. The setting mirrored a legitimate trial, even though its subject was incapable of participation. The charges themselves were not new. They focused on alleged canonical violations from Formosus's earlier career, abandoning his diocese, violating oaths, and unlawfully seeking the papal office. These accusations had already been raised and dismissed during his lifetime. What changed was not the content, but the context. By staging the trial in this way, the court transformed old political grievances into a legal judgment. The corpse allowed the past to be summoned, confronted, and formally condemned. The ritual gave the appearance of a due process, even as it emptied the process of meaning. The verdict declared Formosus guilty on all counts. His papacy was annulled retroactively. The acts he had performed as pope, ordinations, appointments, decisions were declared invalid. His vestments were stripped. The fingers on his right hand were cut off, and his body was removed from consecrated space. Each gesture was symbolic. The vestments represented office, the fingers represented authority and blessing. Their removal was not an act of punishment, but of unmaking. Finally, the body was disposed of, thrown into the Tiber River. This was not merely an attempt to desecrate Formosus. It was an effort to remove him entirely from institutional memory, to deny him a place in both the church and the city. What is striking is how carefully structured the entire process was. The Synod followed recognizable legal forms, while producing an outcome that violated basic assumptions about justice, responsibility, and the limits of authority. This tension is the point. The Cadaver Synod was not chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate, and methodical. It represents a moment when legal ritual was pushed beyond its breaking point. Forced to do a job it was never meant to perform. The retroactive destruction of legitimacy. In the end, the trial did not resolve uncertainty, it exposed it. Instead of restoring authority, the trial exposed how fragile that authority had become. Even in a city accustomed to political violence and rapid changes of power, the spectacle crossed a line. The issue was not sympathy for Formosus. It was the realization that if legitimacy could be undone this way, then no office was secure. Public reaction in Rome was swift. The Synod did not stabilize the political situation. The Pope had presided over the trial. Stephen VI began to lose support among both the clergy and the population. What has been intended as demonstration of control now appeared as obsession and excess. Stephen has misjudged the limits of ritual power. The performance was meant to close a conflict, instead it reopened it, this time directed against him. Within months, resistance turned into action. He was deposed, imprisoned, and ultimately killed, strangled in his cell. Subsequent popes moved quickly to distance the church from this episode. The verdict against Formosus was annulled, his ordinations were restored, his body was reportedly recovered and reburied with proper rites. What remained was not resolution, but damage. The Cadaver Synod entered memory as a warning rather than a precedent. It revealed the point at which legal ritual, when pushed too far, stops producing legitimacy and begins to destroy it. The attempt to erase the past had instead made it impossible to ignore. The collapse sets the stage for the final question, not how such a trial could happen, but why it made sense to those who believed it would work. The Synod was never really about the dead pope. Formosus was already gone. He could not defend himself, and he posed no personal threat. What frightened his enemies was not his body, but the fact that his decisions were still shaping the present. His authority had outlived him, embedded in institutions, offices, and memory. By trying to destroy the past through ritual violence, the Synod exposed a deeper weakness. Authority that needs to exhume its predecessors to survive had already lost its foundations. The performance was too visible, too excessive, too revealing. Instead of closing history, it turned history into a spectacle. The past did not disappear, it became permanent. Formosus' name, which his enemies tried to erase, survived precisely because of the Synod. The trial transformed him from a political actor into a symbol of institutional breakdown. The attempt to rewrite memory fixed it instead. The Cadaver Synod shows what happens when legitimacy is no longer forward looking but defenses, when people stop producing stability and begin to police memory. This is why the Synod failed. It was not irrational, it followed the internal logic of a system in decline. But that logic was self destructive. By turning against its own past, the papacy demonstrated the limits of ritual power and the impossibility of erasing history by force. The dead body on trial was not a scandal. The scandal was that, for a moment, this seemed like a solution.